We are here at Azim Premji University. We are very fortunate to have Professor Ashwini Deshpande with us. Professor Ashwini Deshpande is professor and head of economics at Ashoka University. He heads and is the academic director of Center for Economic Data and Analysis. Professor Deshpande has been one of the pioneering researcher in the field of economics of discrimination. Her work, particularly in the field of economics discrimination, and her specific book on grammars of caste and affirmative action in India is one of the highly cited book that in fact has been one of the work that many of the researchers who follow her work or do the research in this field have been referring to this particular work. We are very thankful to have Professor Ashwini Deshpande with us. Welcome, Professor Deshpande. It's a pleasure to have you with us and to have this conversation with you.
Thank you very much for inviting me to do this conversation. Very happy to be at Azim Premji University and to do this podcast.
So, to start with, Professor Deshpande, the time and space when you started your work, not many economists who are thinking about economics from a lens, economics as discrimination, that perspective was very limited among the economists in general. What made you to think about going into a space and working in this particular space? Can you tell a little more about your journey on this particular work?
Yeah, it's been a journey that even I had not anticipated. As you probably know, my PhD thesis was on international debt of the 1970s. And it had basically few theoretical models about sovereign debt and how countries repay or what happens if they don't repay, etc. And it had a small empirical section, but it was all about international financial flows, the international financial system, etc. And I was going to be continuing to work in that area. As it happened, I got invited by Professor William Darity Jr., who's known as Sandy Darity, because he also has worked on debt. I got invited to do a postdoc fellowship at the University of North Carolina in Chapel Hill in the United States. And at that time, I was supposed to do a book based upon my thesis and some more work that I'd been doing on the Mexican debt crisis. And so I went to the US thinking that I'll be basically working on my book and I will produce that book. And it was the day before Google or even the internet was not so popular in India. So I really didn't know anything about Sandy Darity other than the fact that he had written this book called Loan Pushers. So when I reached there, I discovered that he was African American, and he actually used to think and write extensively about racial inequalities in the United States. And even though I was working on my book and I was working on, sending my chapters off for publication, he used to keep asking me questions about the caste system in India. So I knew about it a little bit, mainly through my father's work and just by growing up in India a little bit, that everybody knows a little bit. So it was very limited, my knowledge. And a lot of the times when I couldn't answer a question that he asked me, I was forced to then read a little bit. But I read it just purely as not an academic exercise. And then he asked me, why don't you work on caste inequalities in India? So I said, but economists don't study caste. This is not economics, that's sociology. Because the way we had grown up at the Delhi school, in Delhi school, sociology department was a very important center and had produced, sort of major work on caste, whether it's M.N. Srinivas or Dipankar Gupta, Andre Bete, all these big luminary names were from the sociology department at the Delhi school. And he said, no, but in the US, economists work on racial inequalities. So then I said, but there's no data on caste really, as far as I knew, because I didn't really know about what kind of data was available because that was not my field. And at that time, he told me to look at the National Family Health Survey, the first and the second National Family Health Survey of India, NFHS, round 1 and round 2. And I had never analyzed a household survey data before because that had not been my field at all. But I couldn't bring myself to tell him that I don't do this because this is not my work. I'm not trained in doing this. I accepted the challenge and somehow, and I said, okay, I'm going to look at the NFHS data. And I wrote my first paper which basically documented the gaps between just the broad administrative categories, scheduled castes, scheduled tribes, and everybody else. Because at that time, the OBC categorization had still not started in the NFHS data. So I could only do a three-way classification. And I found gaps in almost every indicator. And I created an index because the NFHS data doesn't have data on income or wages or wealth, standard data that economists would look at. And so I created what I call the caste development index, something like a human development index of the UN, using actually the same formula. I calculated the CDI for different states, et cetera, et cetera. And I wrote that paper. And when I wrote it, I read it and I said, I thought that the reaction to this paper is going to be, what is new about this paper? We know, everybody knows this. And so I was very hesitant even to send it to anybody to read because I thought this is so obvious that everybody surely knows about all of this. But the reaction to that paper was surprisingly positive. And it turned out that while there was a lot known about individual castes and individual villages through the ethnographies that were done by by other disciplines, anthropologists, sociologists, very little was known about the national level macro data. And it questioned people's beliefs because people genuinely believed that the gaps in the caste system were not as significant as they used to be. And the fact that in 92, 93 or 99, 98, 98, 99, you have gaps pretty much across all domains of socioeconomic well-being across all states. That finding, which to me was sort of obvious, or I thought it would be obvious to everybody, was received surprisingly with a surprising amount of attention. And of course, it wasn't, I'm describing a journey of 6 months in a very short period. It wasn't easy for me because I really didn't know anything about the caste system. So my father, who was a well-known scholar of many things, but amongst them of the Sanskrit texts, the ancient texts, etc., and has written this play called Satyashodak, which is on the life of Mahatma Phule. So he was very knowledgeable about caste in general. So those days there was no Skype or Zoom or anything. So I used to make this one weekly call to my parents from the US, and every call was about what should I read next. And basically he kept giving me a reading list over the phone, and I started reading it, and one thing led to the other. And of course, in the US, internet facilities were better, so I could actually do searches. And so a lot of it was just organic. I read one thing, and then I read another thing, et cetera, et cetera. And I wrote this paper, and I still thought of it as just that one paper. I thought I'll write that paper and then go back to my book. But then Sandy said, okay, why don't you look at the overlap of caste and gender? I said, oh, come on, I just did that one paper. I thought that's it, He said, no, now you have all the data, now you have all the techniques. Why don't you now look at the overlap of caste and gender? So I then started reading about how what we think of as gender gaps are essentially dictated by the norms of the caste system. So I read a lot about the overlap between caste and gender and how gender norms are actually different across different castes. We think of gender norms as this one sort of uniform, overarching set of norms. It's not like that at all. But that was how I started thinking about it. So then I wrote my second paper, and then the third, and then the fourth. And then I started reading about the theoretical literature within economics. And I discovered that actually very well-known economists who, starting from Kenneth Arrow, who's supposed to be the sort of grandfather of modern economics, had written about statistical discrimination, about taste. He wrote about statistical discrimination. Then you had Becker, who'd written about taste-based discrimination. So there had been work on the concept of discrimination by Nobel laureates, by stalwarts in the field. It's just that I had never been introduced to that field of inquiry. So then I started reading more about the theoretical works. I had already read a lot from history, sociology, etc. I'd done these papers. Then I started learning econometric techniques to, estimate discrimination, experimental techniques, etc., etc. So it started from these somewhat random conversations with my friend Sandy Darity, developed into one paper, and then it just developed into a few other papers. And so my 2 years that I spent as as a postdoctoral scholar in the US. I never wrote that book. I just worked on this. And then I submitted a course outline to the Delhi School of Economics called Economics of Discrimination, which was the first time ever that this was taught in any university in India.
I'll come to that particular question again to understand more about what are the kind of situation that you have to go through to offer this particular course, and then transacting through the classes again. But before that, I thought the time period that you were, when you were kind of talking about, is the post-liberalization. I mean, India was going through a kind of a churning. And also, historically, if you have to look at the economists who have been working on varieties of discrimination, class has been a very important factor, and a lot of economists have looked at it from a class perspective, and say land holding as a kind of a way to look at the class, sometime income, wherever income possible data that is available, using that for understanding class. And in that space, when you are getting into talking about caste as a system, and post 1991 also, the euphoria in the society were also slightly different, right? So there are people who are talking about shining India and the kind of transition that is happening, different kinds of jobs that is coming into the space, more IT related revolutions are happening, BPO, KPO, that is also increasing. So in that space, when you are coming back as an economist, talking about caste from a macro perspective, how did you kind of identify yourself among the scholars who are kind of surrounding you in different forms, working on different other formats?
Well, I mean, to speak to the first point that you made, those who spoke about class or income or landholding or whatever it is, they actually never talked of discrimination. It was about inequality. And inequality and discrimination are related, but they are not the same thing. So you're absolutely right that when I entered the landscape of this field, both the economists on the left, the traditional left, they would talk about class oppression, class divide, land inequality, income inequality, etc., wealth inequality. Not so much wealth, but mainly income and land inequality. And economists who are not also on the left, for example, at the Delhi School, has done very pioneering work on overall poverty. So it was always about looking at the group who's below the poverty line and above the poverty line. So you look at the poor, how do you set the poverty line? How do you define what items should go into measuring of the poverty line? So these are very important contributions. I'm not diminishing those at all. But it was always about an income-based or a class-based criterion, which meant that the social identity of the individual, which is assigned at birth, because class is, you do get born into a particular class, but people do transition in and out of poverty as well, right? Whereas the social identities that I was thinking of, which I realized, being in the US, the social identities that I was thinking of were assigned at birth. You are born to a pair of parents who belong to a particular caste, to a particular religion. You are born with a particular sex assigned at birth, you're male or female, etc., etc. So these are circumstances of birth. These are accidents of birth. These are circumstances over the individual has no control, and nothing will change it, right? Religious, at least you can convert out into a different religion, but that also is now in India, it's not so easy. So when I entered the landscape, the word discrimination really was not getting used. It was always about inequality. Right? And I did face a pushback, both from senior colleagues in my department, from sociologists, whose main point was, how can you reduce everything to a number? These are granular experiences, these are on-the-field experiences. Every jati is different. Scheduled castes is a group of jatis, it's not one jati. Yeah. And the experience of every jati is different, which I do not deny at all. Of course it is true. Yet, there are some common features that you observe in the data when you look at scheduled castes as a whole. And at that point, now the traditional left in India does talk about caste, but at that time they did not. They did not. Now they would not like to be reminded of it. But it is true that initially, and this is true also of the traditional left parties, which was caste was seen as something that will divide the working class. So, the idea was to forge a class solidarity, because of the ultimate goal of, overthrowing capitalism or whatever it might have been. So caste was really not so much on the radar, both among the more traditional economists as well as the left economists. And you are absolutely right that there was a belief that the 1991 reforms will just open up new kinds of jobs which will be accessible to everybody. So discrimination of the old kind will gradually start to decline. And that's not just the economists. So even within the Dalit movement, there was a belief which continues to date, and there are publications which said that the market is a solution to caste discrimination. Because why would the market discriminate, right? So if you get out of the agrarian economy, you go into the urban economy, go into the formal sector, that will ultimately reduce caste discrimination. So, and with those kinds of positions, somebody comes along and says, well, caste discrimination is alive and persistent and is being replicated in contemporary times. It's not just a hangover from what used to happen in the past. It was, how shall I put it? It was both received very well, by well, I mean people were willing to accept, listen to a new idea, but there was also pushback. So I think both things happened. But I was very glad for the fact that people were willing to listen. And today, for example, if you go to any economics seminar about any development problem in India, if somebody does not talk of caste, that's a problem. Yeah. Everyone will say, well, where is the analysis by caste? Where is the analysis by gender? So today it has become so standard that you don't even think about it. I'm not saying I take all the credit, but I have played a tiny role. I played a tiny role in the early part of the journey. So I'm very, I'm not happy about the fact that caste discrimination still exists, but I'm at least glad that many, many more people are today talking about it. And today you don't have to justify to anybody. Whether it's a mainstream economist, whether it's a left economist, everybody talks of caste now. Everybody recognizes that this is a problem. And I think that's important. Recognition comes first, solutions come later. But as long as we are recognizing it, I think that's very positive.
You have been humble, in fact, to say that you played a very tiny role, but your role has been very significant. In fact, it was, I would say, don't you think it was quite a bold decision for you to kind of imagine a course on economics of discrimination? Because the department and university where you are in, you had stalwarts from sociology who have kind of had significant contribution around this, particularly in specific micro context and very rich knowledge and depth around it. And so in that context, how did you imagine the course like a kind of introducing a course of economics of discrimination, and then following it through in the classroom? How did you kind of navigate through this kind of a journey?
Well, the title of the course came from Gary Becker's book, which I read, one of my early readings when I was in the US. And I just thought the title was fabulous. It just nicely summarized. Of course, he talks about taste-based discrimination. That's only one theory. But it was a very nice title. And basically what I did was not everything, the main things that I had learned during my journey. Because as I said, when I started these conversations with Sandy Darity, I literally really knew very little about the caste system. And I myself went on a journey and I picked up things and I said, okay, I think all this can be put together in the form of a course. And I was still abroad actually when I submitted, because Delhi University has revisions of courses only periodically, only once in 10 years. So one course revision was coming up. So I thought if I don't do it now, then another 10 years I have to wait. So I sent my course outline and I wasn't there to defend it. And from what I heard later, that some people were skeptical. They wondering is this economics? Does this course belong in an economics department? But fortunately for me, there were enough people who supported me in my absence. And they said, why not? Let's introduce this course and then we'll see how it goes. And initially it was a very boutique, very tiny niche kind of a course, because students also didn't know what is this about? Is this a theory course? Is it an empirical course? Is it sociology? Is it economics? What is this? How will it help us in the job market? And I would be very candid and I would say it will probably not help you in the job market directly, but it will enrich your understanding of India so that whatever you do in your life later on, insights that you get from this course will help you along the way. And one thing I must tell you is that the trajectory of students when they start the course and when they end, not everybody is convinced by everything that I'm saying, and that's fine. I think that shows that people think independently. But many of them start thinking differently. And what is most gratifying is I'm getting an email today from saying, oh, you taught me 15 years ago, you don't remember. But yesterday I was watching a movie, or yesterday this thing happened in my office, or I saw this on the road, I read this story in the newspaper, and I was suddenly reminded of that lesson in the economics of discrimination class where we did whatever it is that we had done. So later on through their life journeys, some parts of what they learned resonate, and they're able to spot, those features in live cinema, books around them. And it resonates enough that they take the trouble to email me. I mean, what more can a teacher ask for? I mean, that's the best tribute that any teacher can get. So I just have found the journey, of this course, and I have learned a lot through the course, because students are very sharp. They are young, they are thinking, they have questions, and you can't take things for granted. You can't just spout off some theories with some big name words and say, okay, this is it, now learn it. And so they question you. And I think having to deal with a young audience year after year after year has helped me refine my ideas, has helped me to think about, oh, this is something I can work on. So sometimes they'll ask a question on which I'm not aware of the evidence. And so then it gets me to think of what can I do to produce the evidence on this particular issue. And I'm not saying all my papers were written like that, but the ideas of some of the papers that I've subsequently written have come through classroom discussions. So I think overall I'm very, very gratified by the journey. And now I'm at Ashoka University. I offer the same course there as well. And it's really gratifying.
When you started this career, it was part of a public university, and we get students from all walk of life, and sometimes certain times this positionality also comes in different ways. Who you are as a teacher, who students are, what background they are coming from. Did you find it as a kind of a little struggle when you started offering these courses, and did this give you new ideas that how I should kind of deal with or engage with the class in this kind of a situation when it comes to me?
Yeah, there was pushback, and every class there has been a pushback. And the interesting thing is, there is not that much pushback on the theories or on the evidence. But the minute I come to the remedies, then there's pushback. So there is some sort of a disconnect between kind of accepting the evidence, but when you say, okay, now if this is the evidence and we need to do something about it, which means something needs to change in the current policy framework, when that idea is introduced, then there's a lot of pushback. So, and it has to do, as you correctly pointed out, with who the students are, what kind of backgrounds they come from. And interestingly, I face greater pushback in Delhi University than I face in Ashoka. Because what Ashoka does is the first year of undergraduate studies is all liberal arts. So they just do these foundation courses, great books, big ideas, etc. So they don't start on their economics journey until the second year. So in their first year, they are introduced to a whole range of ideas of, very important thinkers. So they are already conditioned to think about social problems. And I was originally expecting that I'll face a greater pushback in Ashoka. But, contrary to what I expected, I've faced a greater pushback in Delhi University from the students. By the end of the course, however, many people who didn't accept whatever evidence I was presenting changed their mind. Some people didn't. That's fine. I mean, that's what, education is all about. Yes. I don't want to brainwash students, but as long as I introduce a thought in their head and they keep thinking about it, I think that's good enough.
And a lot of these are evidence-based. You are bringing in different kinds of database to support this kind of ideas, and they can see through this process also.
Yeah, so I think that evidence-based, I think that's a point that I forgot to mention, and thank you for mentioning it, is that I don't make any assertions without evidence. So it's never about, the caste system is this or that or whatever it is. I use very few adjectives. So I just will say, this is what the data is showing. These are the percentages on whatever the indicator is. So there are very few adjectives that I will use. I will just show them the data. I'll show them my regression results. I'll show them, estimations, and then they can criticize my methods. But there are no preconceived notions that I'm saying, okay, you have to believe me because what I'm telling you is some sort of a gospel truth or whatever. So they don't see any agenda, and I don't have an agenda. I'm just trying to understand a problem. And I think that approach really helps. It really helps. So I think evidence-based is a very important part of this journey.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And you have also influenced a lot of next generation researcher. That includes some of us also. I, along with Dr. Sridevi, we have been working on food and nutrition security by caste. NFHS data has become a very important database for many of us to work on different ways to look at discrimination. Even recently that we have been working on something called rural deprivation as a team here. We have a small team which works on development dialogue with data, which is very similar kind of thing that you have been doing on publicly available data. So we have seen this kind of work also has been influenced by some of your pioneering works. And one of these is your very well cited, celebrated book on grammar of caste. Would you like to kind of, instead of me saying something about it, it would be nice to hear from you. What is the essence of this book that when you wrote it? And this, by the time you write it, also the grammar of it, you would have experienced it in a different ways. One side is macro data, but there are a lot of other realities that you would have kind of experienced in different other formats, along with students, researchers, and critics, so many other people. So what made you to write this book, and what is the kind of gist, essence, or the message of this book particularly, if you have to say?
Yes. So, I mean, at that point, again, I think I probably had, I don't remember exactly, but I don't know, 7, 8 papers or something like that on different aspects of caste disparities, and some essays on reservations, affirmative action, etc. And actually, Kaushik Basu, who was my advisor for my PhD, and is now a good friend, he said, why don't you summarize your main arguments in the form of a book? Because, papers are read by specialists, and a book is always, more public facing. You'll get better engagement. So I thought I was too young to write a book, or, it was too early in my career. And then I said, well, why not? Why don't I think about it? And so I started then writing about the conclusions of different papers in a more public facing kind of a way. So it's not a collection of papers. These are chapters written afresh based upon the conclusions of my paper. And I realized that when I was doing that, I suddenly had to make connections because the book reads like a flow. It's not a series of papers that have been edited together or something like that. And it made me read much more in order to be able to write that. And so that was that. The other component that I thought was new and needed to go into the book was a set of studies that we had done with a team that at that time was visiting from Princeton. Because one of the puzzles I always had, even through with the data, etc., is in urban India, how do people figure out caste, particularly in cosmopolitan settings? Because Jati names are very region specific. So even I'm from Maharashtra, but even in Maharashtra, I don't know all the Jati names. There could be some Maharashtrian coming and some surname will be there. I won't know exactly, necessarily, what Jati that person belongs to. Some names I know, some I don't. But for example, if I came to Karnataka and if I heard different people's names, I have no clue. I have zero clue about what caste they might belong to. And it's not just me, everybody. But if you look at the data in urban India, even if you take only the metros and if you take places like Bangalore or whatever, you see very clear hierarchies by broad administrative categories, SC, ST, OBC, and everybody else. How does it happen? I mean, on the one hand, you were saying caste is not ascriptive, surnames some of them are identifiable, a lot of them are not identifiable. Then how does caste replicate itself? So it was a puzzle. And there was this team visiting from Princeton, and a few of us, got together. And they said, let's devise a project to understand how caste operates in urban India in the formal sector. Because in the informal sector, again, recruitment is through caste networks. Contractors will, get, if they want painters for a building, they'll get a particular caste group to do the painting, etc. So again, it's not difficult to understand why that would be the case. But how does it operate in the formal sector? And so together we devised 4 studies. I'm a co-author on one of them, and each of us was a co-author on one. And that was a completely a new sort of understanding for me personally. And my particular study was about, it was a college work. So basically, we interviewed students who were in their last semesters of their courses, and they were going to go on to the job market. And we interviewed students from JNU, Delhi University, and Jamia, which this was before all these private universities came up, before APU, before Ashoka. And so these universities were the best really in the country. And so these students were really well qualified and well placed to achieve a good labor market outcome. And they were trained similarly. So we took samples from the same subject. So from within economics, within political science, within sociology, etc. And we followed them for 2 years. So we did 4 interviews with them after 6 months, with a gap of 6 months. And at the end of the 2 years, we found that the trajectories of these students had completely diverged. So the upper caste students were doing much better in whatever job that they were doing compared to the Dalit students. And so this was, what we were hoping not to observe, because we thought at least when you graduate from places like the best universities in the country, and you live in Delhi, you go to Bombay, Bangalore, Chennai, whatever, so you go to the metros, you shouldn't see such obvious outcomes. And yet we saw them. And so and many of these people had jobs in the private sector where there's no reservation. So you don't have to tick a box saying that you're SC or anything like that. How do you figure it out? And then along with this, there was a companion study of human resource managers of 25 big companies, multinational companies and big domestic firms in the Delhi NCR region. And they were done by, so Surinder Jotka led the one on the HR managers, I led the one on the college to work. And these were done, separately, and we both arrived at the same answer, which is that when students or when candidates go into the job interview in the private sector, almost one of the first questions that the interview panel asks them is, what is your family background? Now, that question is not only meant to elicit caste, but it's to get an idea of what kind of a family you come from. So parents, occupation, number of siblings, what do your siblings do? And we asked in my study, I asked the students who was following up, I said, what did you feel when they asked you this question? And so the upper caste students said, nothing, it was just ice breaking, just to break the ice. You know how you get to just relaxing before the actual interview starts. So they didn't think there was anything wrong in us with that question, or they didn't think there was a hidden agenda. But the Dalit students said, we know why they asked us this question, because they had figured out something about our caste, and this was their way of getting us to admit what our caste is. So they found some kind of an agenda, what sociologists call the interpretive disposition. So the interpretive disposition of the upper caste students was different from that of the Dalit students for the same question, even though both were asked the same question. And we realized that Indian employers, even those who speak the language of merit, and at that time there was a lot of emphasis on meritocracy, people should get the job based upon their qualifications and nothing else. We are building a modern, competitive India, globalization, the post-liberalization feeling, and so it should be all on merit, etc. But so employers were not lying. They genuinely wanted a meritorious candidate, except that their view of what made an individual person meritorious was linked to what social background they came from. It was a combination of caste, religion, class, everything, So they had a lot of stereotypes. Yes. Tamilian Brahmins are good at maths, something like that. So-and-so people are not good at this, or something like that. And they want somebody good at maths. So in that sense, they are thinking of ability or merit, except that who possesses that ability is defined by their social identity. And my co-author, who was American, she said that this question is illegal in a job interview. Because if you are giving a job to a person based upon their qualifications, then you can only ask about their qualifications. Whether the father was this or that, mother was this or that, brother was this or that, mother, father, brother are not applying for the job, right? How can they even ask this question? I said, in India, they ask. And so she said, in the US, nobody can ask this question. I mean, they have other ways of figuring things out. So US is a different story, but you are interviewing the candidate for a job. And the only reason that a candidate gets or does not get the job, or gets this wage offer or that wage offer, whatever it is, it has to be based exclusively and only on the qualities or the intrinsic merit or whatever it is, however you are measuring it, of that particular candidate. And so the belief in meritocracy goes hand in hand with a set of stereotypes about who is meritorious, and that is how the caste inequalities get perpetuated in urban India formal sector. And this was, for me, a completely mind-blowing revelation. It now seems obvious to me, but at that time it was new. And I thought this must go into the book, And so, yeah, that's...
And you also worked on Indian Railways also, right?
Yes.
And I mean, that is one of the largest public sector kind of employment giving organization, if you can think of. So your finding or whatever, does that also resonate there pretty well in how kind of the job market, particularly if you have to see from Indian Railways employment perspective?
So the thing is that in the US again, they didn't have reservation, but they had affirmative action in the form of diversity, which is of course now being rolled back under Trump. But before that, they had affirmative action in the form of diversity, equity, inclusion, DEI initiatives. But because it was different firms or different places, workplaces at different DEI scenarios, and they were reporting their racial and gender breakup to the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, EEOC. In the US, you can do studies of the effect of affirmative action policies because you have data before a program starts and you have data after the program starts, right? So you can look at whether affirmative action negatively impacts productivity, for example. So there are papers like that in the US context. So we thought, so my co-author Thomas Weisskopf, another very well-known economist, Tom and I said, how can we do this in India? But of course, in India, you don't have a before and after data because the reservations for SC/ST started actually during the British time. Yeah. And it's the same list that the Indian government carried forward and then some changes were made to it. So the first instance of reservation actually is from the 1910s, that decade. Yeah.
1901 census in some sense was kind of defining time for identifying caste, and in some kind of 1911 census.
Right. And so both in British administered territories as well as in the some of the more progressive royal, princely states, Maharaja of Kolhapur, Maharaja of Baroda, Maharaja of Travancore. They were some of the more progressive princely state administrators who then introduced untouchable entry into colleges, untouchables into in government employment, and untouchability was not illegal at that point. After independence, untouchability became illegal, so nobody was an untouchable. But the list of scheduled castes was basically from the same depressed classes list that was before. So you really don't have a before and after. And so when we started thinking of, Tom and I started talking about, can we look at the effect of reservation, SC/ST reservation in India on enterprise efficiency? So we said, okay, but how do you know? We don't have data for enterprise efficiency before and we don't have it for after. So how are we going to do this? And so we racked our brains and long story, but basically in the annual report of the different zones of the Indian Railways, you have the proportion of employees in that zone, in the four, Group A, Group B, Group C, Group D, which are the four categories of government employment, all employees, numbers of all employees, and SC/ST employees that have come through reservation. So you can calculate the proportion of SC/ST by zone and by year. So we literally manually copied, one of my students, she sat in the Rail Bhavan library and manually copied these numbers. And we collected data for 23 years across the railway zones. And because reservations don't get implemented to 100% in every zone in every year, we found some variation. So there were zone years where SC/ST proportions were high, and there were zone years when SC/ST proportions were low. If we had 100% reservation, we could not have done this study. But because we didn't, we could then see whether the zone years with high SC/ST proportions were less efficient in terms of railway productivity compared to zone years where SC/ST proportions were low. And because the data was large for 23 years, and we show actually that it's not the case. If anything, if you look at the SC/ST proportion in the top decision-making category A and B jobs, who are the managers and decision makers, so SC/ST proportions in A and B category jobs in certain cases led to an increase in productivity. So not only did reservations not impact productivity negatively, in some cases you found an increase if you focus on SC/ST in the decision-making positions. So this was the first study that looked at the impact of reservations on productivity, and it's only because you can't do a before-after. Subsequently, people have done other things, and somebody, for example, got access to IAS personal record data. So that there's a paper now that looks at impact of reservations on IAS officers' performance, and they again find the same thing. Then there's a paper now that has a book, which is now a book actually, a political scientist, Francesca Jensenius. She's looked at SC/ST elected representatives and looked at constituency level indicators, and you don't find that constituencies where SC/STs have elected are worse in controlling for other things, etc. So now there's a bunch of studies that look at the impact of reservations on different indicators, but ours was the first. And then, so this whole body of literature is very interesting, and it's all very creative because you don't have data in an obvious way. You have to
think through the process. Very interesting. Let me come to one of the last part of the questions. One thought process that we all know, kind of the evidences are also showing up, that its capability is a very important dimension of it. And so having basic healthcare, having access to basic education and higher education, all those things play important role in kind of affirmative action in certain ways for communities. It can be based on gender, or can be based on caste, or religion, or so many other kinds of parameters. But what is your thought process that we have seen those kind of things, that okay, these are better off in relation to those who are not getting this? But what happens, what do you call the kind of is there a kind of hitting a glass ceiling? And that glass ceiling is important, particularly in modern Indian context, when where more of urbanization is happening, and I think majority of population are now going to live in urban areas, right? So whether we see this kind of trend, it's visible in urban space too, that despite having a good education, having a decent health, but you can reach this far or thus far, and you can't go beyond this. So how do you see this is panning out in, say, urban scape, both in terms of caste, in terms of gender, or in terms of intersectionality of this?
So I think it's not a linear process. So I think to assume that, the growth of urbanization or the growth of the markets or whatever will automatically solve. So I would say that having access to education, having a decent rate of growth, because unless you have a rate of growth of output, people's overall well-being is not going to increase. So I will not dismiss the GDP angle completely, right? It's important being poor is no solution to anything, right? And so I think for overall living standards to improve is important. And having access to education is important. Having access to healthcare is important. All of these things are important in their own way. So they are necessary conditions, but not sufficient. They are necessary just for capabilities or human well-being in general. And they can also reduce disparities to a certain extent. But just having these conditions in place is not going to solve both the problem of intergroup disparities as well as discrimination. And we should also recognize, just looking at what's going on around in the world, not just in India, is that a lot of, take any phase, basically countries go through phases, In the US, there was one time when diversity, equity and inclusion initiatives were everywhere. All firms had to have a DEI officer. All firms had to do DEI. Now, everybody has to roll back DEI, right? Now, does this mean that DEI has failed? No. I think there are political trends that come and go in different countries. that shape a lot of the policy framework. And while as academics, we can't really control that or we can't do anything about it, but we can recognize them for what it is, right? So as an academic, I have no illusion that I can control the policy framework in any dimension. But it is important to be cognizant of the interplay of economics, politics together on social change or the lack of it. And, it's one step forward, sometimes several steps back. Then again, so it's not a linear process. If you look at like a 100-year, period, you realize that countries have gone through very, very bad periods and also gone through very good periods, right? So that's human history for you. But therefore, to reject, we shouldn't focus on growth because that's not solving any problems, that view I cannot take. Because particularly for countries like ours, where a substantial number of people still are very, very poor, this post-growth agenda and all I don't think is for our country. We need basic, post-growth is all very well when you have basic needs are fully taken care of, and then you can have the luxury of talking about post-growth. Not us, I don't think. So I think that we need to reconcile the objective of, we don't still have basic healthcare for all, basic education for, we have education for all, basic health for all, but the quality. So we have to reconcile the objective of providing a decent standard of living to all people, along with the objective of reducing disparities and discrimination, which is easy to say in one sentence, but not at all easy to actually implement. But I'm saying that first part of what I said, which is to improve people's standard of living, we cannot let go of that. Whether you look at China, whether you look at Vietnam, South Korea, all of these countries, they did lift, China, the reduction in poverty has been spectacular, right? So if they had not focused on growth, they would not have been able to do it, right? So I think that we cannot lose sight of that also. But equally, you realize that this is not automatically going to take care of discrimination. What will take care of discrimination? I don't know. I think it's a multifaceted, multi-pronged approach. I think the input has to come from many different quarters. Academics can provide some input. Social movements is another source. Advocacy groups is another source. And the groups that are getting discriminated against, their own organization. That's ultimately, one can be a fellow traveler. Yes. But at the end of the day, it's also the organization. So it is complicated. And we move a few steps forward and then several steps back and then few steps forward again, So that's...
In fact, we are working on some of this kind of database. I don't know if you have heard of this Mission Antyodaya database, which gives... provides data in recent time. Almost like 98% of Indians' villages are covered. So near census for rural India. And we are looking at these basic amenities like a hospital, education, school, Anganwadi, etc. So this basic amenities availability and deep deprivation in terms of like say in 10 kilometers range it is available or not. And this significant number of villages across the countries don't have access to that. So the availability of not being there itself is a first condition to access it, and then access there are discrimination, and then you find when they will have their basic health, basic education in place, and then we'll talk about when we have lot kind of to do before even think about many of these things. So just to come to a little conclusion before this, as we started the conversation, we are talking about like look at countries like who have been kind of living democracy in certain ways for centuries now. So US, for example, if you take, or say UK, some Scandinavian countries as well. But you find discrimination, different format, they come up in different ways. So US, we have racial discrimination that we hear about. Religious minority related discriminations are seen in some countries which seem to be a lot better. Suddenly when the question of refugee and those things comes up, they're clueless in certain ways how to deal with those kind of spaces. So if we are kind of envisioning a certain kind of end that we are seeing, I'm sure you would be the happiest person to see that if I don't have to teach economics of discrimination at all, right? In society there is no discrimination. Even if you imagine as an utopia, What is your kind of imagination views around it? Do you see a kind of light at the end of the tunnel somewhere, or there are hopes or there are a lot of hopelessness?
I don't know, honestly. I mean, the thing is, as I said, see, when you think of discrimination against a group or several groups, remember that just as some people are deprived or suffer on account of discrimination, some people benefit or thrive because of discrimination. So it is not in their interest to end discrimination. And at the end of the day, it's going to be a struggle, it's going to be a conflict between those who want discriminatory systems to continue and those who want discriminatory systems to end. And it's going to be a long drawn out, it has been a long drawn out protracted struggle. So for example, if you look at women's rights in the United States, over the 1970s, 80s, 90s, women earned a whole new set of rights in the US. I think till the early 70s, women couldn't even have a credit card in their name without having a male co-guarantor in the United States in 1970. I'm not talking about 16th century or anything like that, right? So many universities in the very well-known universities in the West didn't even admit female students until in the 1960s, 70s, 80s is when you find students getting admitted. So the 70s onwards, the big wave of feminism brought to women certain very, very important rights, which are their fundamental rights as citizens, adult citizens. Today, many of those rights are under threat, right? So the right to abortion, for example, the right over your body, reproductive control, that is a huge right that's been more or less taken away from American women. So obviously, it's been many decades of gain and then a backsliding, right? If you look at the anti-immigrant sentiment, which is not just prevalent in the US, but also all over Europe, very far-right parties everywhere gaining ground, including in Scandinavian countries, which was this sort of utopia for equality and so on and so forth. So you must recognize that the reason discriminatory systems exist in the first place is because somebody is benefiting from it. It works in somebody's advantage. It works to somebody's advantage. And so when that starts to get dismantled and threatened, there will be a pushback, which is what you're experiencing right now. How this will end and when it will end, your guess is as good as mine. But I think we need to just brace ourselves for the fact that we shouldn't take any progress for granted.
Yes.
We can't say, okay, we achieved progress up to this point and now it's here to stay. Now we can only build on it. There might be backsliding, and then we have to start all over again or start, so if democracy is under threat or if any other right is under threat, then you have to, but if you look at the long arc of human history, yes, there has been progress. So I'm not hopeless.
Yes.
I'm not hopeless. I think if you plot a trend line over the last 200 years, in a huge number of dimensions, human society as a whole has made progress. Of course, there are climate change issues, there's sustainability issues, so those big picture threats remain. But in terms of lives of people, there have been many, many, many gains over the 200-year period.
Yes.
Of course, that 200-year period has not been uniform, right?
Yeah.
So I think overall I'm an optimist.
Yeah.
And one has to be, otherwise, if you get hopeless due to some immediate setbacks, then that doesn't work. So.
But if we look at the Constituent Assembly debate that happened, and when topics of caste, scheduled areas were being discussed, the different kinds of viewpoints that was there from 1947-50 in that phase to today's time, if you see, I think I agree with you that the kind of progress that we have made as a society, I think they are tremendous in many ways, and that gives us a lot of hope. But this struggle never going to end. There are parties who would also benefit from this process, and hence
it's an uneven progress. It's not. I mean, on the one hand, there has been a lot of progress, but it's uneven. It's been there have been ups and downs. But overall, I mean, I think of my grandmother's life, and I think of my life, and I think of my daughter's life. Same family, same country. when I tell my daughter stories about my grandmother's life, she doesn't recognize it at all. She has never seen anything like that, right? So this is within 3-4 generations. You see this huge change in the lives of women. And again, I'm not saying it's uniform in every region, it's uniform every I'm not saying that. But overall, you step back and look at the long arc of history. Overall, there's progress. So I remain an optimist.
Yeah, this gives us a lot of hope. It was a real pleasure talking to you, Professor Ashwini Deshpande, and I'm sure we'll kind of gain a lot from this discussion when people kind of talk about the kind of work that you have been doing. I'm sure it will inspire quite a bit of young researchers also who are interested to work on this. Now there is no such taboo. They are not the first people to kind of get into this. I think opportunities are many, and I'm sure they will get into doing a lot more research in different such field of.
They already are, by the way. So when I now see young people looking at questions of caste and gender, they're so imaginative, so creative, and there's so much interesting work going on today. So it's absolutely fabulous,
so
mind-blowing
that
stuff.
Gives us another hope as teachers and researchers that we have been working. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. It was a pleasure. And thank you for having me on this show.
Thank you.